Hi, I'm Matthew from Dark Ascent, and today we're looking at the richest man on the mountain, where ego quietly set the stage for everything that followed. A cantilevered cliff deck, already barely holding under temporary supports, buckled as 50+ seeping winds and heavy snow loading pushed it past its limit right before it peeled away from the rock face. Knowing it drops nearly 200 feet straight down into open air makes the whole moment hard to sit with. It was January 23, 2016. A major winter storm had settled over the mountains surrounding Telluride Mountain Village, Colorado, bringing heavy snowfall, whiteout conditions, and wind gusts strong enough to shake structures along the exposed ridgelines. Nishil Lamkin, 58, was one of the region's most recognizable luxury developers, known for building high-end homes in locations many contractors considered too risky or difficult to develop. Over the years, he had built a reputation for taking on steep alpine sites and designing dramatic cliffside structures that emphasized open views and exposed architecture. Many of his projects featured large, cantilevered decks and expansive glass walls that appeared to hang directly over the mountainside. Repeated success with these tough builds really built up his confidence in his own judgment, especially when it came to engineering decisions and construction risks. He felt like pushing past normal limits was what set his work apart from everyone else's. Over time, he started treating cautious advice from engineers or inspectors less like safety warnings and more like annoying obstacles in the way of getting things done. Not everyone on site saw it that way. Lamkin's professional reputation was inextricably linked to his ability to execute these complex designs. He cultivated an image of a visionary who could tame the rugged environment, often publicly dismissing conservative engineering approaches as lacking imagination or being overly cautious. This attitude permeated his company culture, where efficiency and aesthetic boldness were prioritized over redundant safety measures. He was known to personally review and often modify engineering specifications, favoring what he termed elegant solutions that reduced material and labor costs. These modifications, while sometimes yielding more visually appealing or cost-effective results in less extreme conditions, often came at the expense of traditional safety margins. His latest undertaking, a multi-million-dollar residence situated on Ridge Road, approximately 9,500 feet above sea level, exemplified his signature style. It hung out over nothing but air and distance. The property boasted an exceptionally large, cantilevered deck that extended over a sheer, south-facing drop-off, offering unobstructed views of the surrounding peaks. The structural design of this deck, a point of particular pride for Lamkin, relied on a series of minimalist steel beams anchored into the bedrock, intended to create an illusion of lightness and suspension. The deck itself measured approximately 25 feet by 40 feet, with nearly 15 feet of its length extending unsupported over the cliff edge. The primary structural elements consisted of 6 I-beams, each 12 inches deep, embedded into a reinforced concrete foundation and extending outwards. Temporary wooden shoring, consisting of 6 posts, was in place at approximately 10-foot intervals along the outer edge, intended to be removed once the final decking and railing were installed. The construction was nearing completion, with only cosmetic finishes remaining, including the installation of custom glass panels along the railing and the final application of a weather-resistant sealant to the decking surface. Snow had been building up across the San Juan Mountains all winter, but by late January, it was clear something heavier was coming in. Weather services and local avalanche warnings started picking up the tone, flagging the Telluride area for a stretch of serious snowfall ahead. These advisories detailed a high probability of heavy, wet snow accumulation, coupled with sustained high winds and a subsequent increase in avalanche danger. The specific threat to structures, particularly those with large horizontal surfaces like decks, was the potential for extreme snow loading, a condition where the weight of accumulated snow could exceed design specifications. Historical data for the area indicated that while heavy snowfalls were common, the combination of predicted density and wind-driven accumulation was unusual for the month of January. Even seasoned builders pay attention to that kind of warning. The forecast specifically called for 2.3 feet of new snow over a 24-hour period, with peak wind gusts exceeding 50 mph at elevations above 9,000 feet. These warnings were widely disseminated through local media, construction industry alerts, and direct communications from the county building department. Hazy Schreiner, a junior structural engineer recently hired by Lamkin's firm, was tasked with reviewing the structural plans for the Ridge Road deck in light of the impending weather. Her analysis, based on current meteorological projections and standard engineering load tables for the region, indicated that the anticipated snow depth and density could impose stresses dangerously close to and potentially exceeding the design limits of the deck's temporary support system. Specifically, Schreiner's calculations showed that a snow depth of 3 feet of wet, compacted snow, combined with a wind load of 50 mph, would generate a distributed load of approximately 120 pounds per square foot on the deck surface. That kind of numbers gets attention fast. The temporary supports, critical during this phase of construction, were rated for a maximum of 90 psf, a figure that Lampkin himself had specified to reduce material costs and installation time. Schreiner presented her findings to Lampkin in a detailed report, complete with structural diagrams, stress calculations, and comparative analyses of similar structures in high-load environments. She recommended the immediate installation of additional temporary shoring, specifically suggesting a doubling of the existing 6 ZX6 posts and the application of a de-icing system to prevent excessive snow accumulation. She emphasized the narrow safety margins, particularly concerning the connection points of the cantilevered beams where the stress concentrations were highest. Her report included diagrams illustrating potential failure modes under the predicted load, highlighting the risk of shear failure at the beam-to-foundation interface. The construction foreman, a seasoned local with over 2 decades of experience building in the challenging Telluride environment, independently voiced similar concerns. He had observed Lampkin's tendency to push limits and had witnessed previous instances where Lampkin's confidence in his designs bordered on recklessness. The foreman's practical assessment highlighted the difficulty of manually clearing snow from such an exposed structure during a blizzard and the potential for ice damming to add unforeseen weight. He advocated for a temporary work stoppage and the reinforcement of the deck's supports, suggesting that the cost of these preventative measures, estimated at less than $5,000 for additional shoring and temporary heating elements, was negligible compared to the potential for structural failure and associated liabilities. He also pointed out that the current weather conditions would make any emergency repairs or snow removal extremely dangerous for his crew, and that delaying these measures until after the storm would be too late. He specifically mentioned the risk of uneven snow loading, where wind patterns could create significantly deeper drifts in certain areas of the deck, leading to localized stress points. Lampkin, however, dismissed both Schreiner's detailed calculations and the foreman's experienced warnings. That moment changed the tone of everything that followed. He viewed their caution as an affront to his expertise and an unnecessary expenditure that would delay the project and inflate costs. He reiterated his belief in the inherent strength of his minimalist design, arguing that the deck had been engineered to withstand far greater forces than a typical winter storm. He kept going back to the bedrock anchors, and the steel, like that alone, was enough to carry it. What he didn't really give enough weight to was how much those temporary supports were doing at that stage. Even when others were saying they should slow down or add more bracing, he wasn't really treating it like a fresh look at engineering anymore. It was more that he trusted his own call and didn't want to back down to what he probably saw as everyone else being too cautious. He instructed the team to proceed as planned, emphasizing that any delays would be unacceptable. This decision, made in the face of clear and escalating warnings, underscored Lampkin's characteristic overconfidence and his consistent underestimation of the natural forces at play in the high alpine environment. The stage was set for the approaching blizzard to test not only the structural integrity of his design, but also the limits of his ego. At that point, everything was already in motion. As the late afternoon of January 22nd transitioned into evening, the predicted blizzard descended upon Telluride Mountain Village with increasing ferocity. Snowfall rates intensified, quickly accumulating several inches per hour. The wind, initially gusting, became a sustained, howling force, driving snow horizontally and reducing visibility to near zero. Temperatures plummeted further, settling around 30 degrees, with wind chill factors making outdoor conditions hazardous. By the evening, local authorities had issued a broad travel advisory for the region, urging residents and non-essential personnel to remain indoors as the storm continued to intensify. You can already feel how serious the weather was getting at that point. Road conditions across the mountain passes were deteriorating quickly, with drifting snow, low visibility, and increasing avalanche risk along exposed routes. Despite the warnings, Nikhil Lampkin remained at the construction site along Ridge Road. Earlier in the day, he had already dismissed the remaining crew, instructing them to leave the area and return only once conditions improved and the storm had fully passed. The decision left the site largely unattended, with only ongoing snowfall and wind shaping the exposed structure through the night. Sometime later, a snowplow operator passing through the corridor briefly noted a heavy-duty pickup truck parked near the access road leading into the property. The vehicle's engine appeared to be running intermittently, its headlights cutting faintly through the blowing snow before fading again into the whiteout. The observation stood out because few vehicles were present on the mountain at that point, and even fewer were attempting to remain near active construction sites under such conditions. The presence of the truck strongly suggested that Lampkin was still on site, despite the worsening weather and repeated public advisories urging people to avoid unnecessary travel or outdoor activity. Seeing a vehicle like that half buried in a storm says more than words ever could. Throughout the night, Lampkin made repeated trips to the exposed deck. The security guard, stationed at the main entrance to the Ridge Road development, noted Lampkin's snowmobile departing and returning from the construction site every hour or so, even as the storm raged. Each time Lampkin carried a shovel, returning with snow-covered gear. These inspections, conducted in extreme conditions, were not for safety in the conventional sense, but rather a personal vigil, a test of his design against the elements. He manually cleared sections of the deck, attempting to mitigate the accumulating snow load, a task that became increasingly futile as the snowfall continued unabated. The heavy, wet snow, characteristic of high-altitude storms, began to compact under its own weight, increasing its density and, consequently, the stress it exerted on the structure. The deck was only designed to handle about 60 psf of live load and 40 psf of snow, but what it was actually seeing in spots was way beyond that. In certain areas where the snow had piled up and packed in, the pressure was pushing past 100 psf unevenly, just from how the wind was moving it around and how it was settling. That kind of weight piling up unevenly is never a good mix. The wind just wouldn't settle. It would hit the structure in bursts, suddenly pushing way more force onto it for a few seconds, then easing off again. That back and forth kept stressing the connections over and over, like a constant push and release that never really let up. By early morning on January 23rd, approximately 2 feet of fresh snow had accumulated on the deck surface. The wind continued to buffet the structure, creating significant drifts and uneven loading. The minimalist temporary supports, which Lampkin had refused to reinforce, were now bearing a load far exceeding their intended capacity. The steel beams, designed for aesthetic lightness, began to exhibit subtle signs of stress, though these would have been imperceptible to the untrained eye in the whiteout conditions. The connections between the cantilevered sections and the main structure, already a point of concern for Hazy Schreiner from both the vertical snow load and the lateral forces of the wind. Microfractures, invisible to the naked eye, were likely forming in the concrete anchors and steel welds, gradually compromising the structural integrity. The temperature fluctuations, though slight, also contributed to material fatigue. Earlier that morning, a neighboring property owner, whose home sat several hundred yards from the construction site, began hearing intermittent creaking and groaning sounds coming from somewhere beyond the ridge. His property was partially shielded from the direct wind, which made the noises stand out against the otherwise constant roar of the storm. He initially assumed the sounds were coming from shifting snow on his own roof or trees bending under the weight of the blizzard. But over time, the noises became difficult to ignore. He later described the sounds as deep, slow, and resonant, like heavy structural components straining under pressure. It's the kind of noise you don't really forget once you've heard it described. At intervals, the groaning would briefly stop before returning again, louder and more prolonged than before. The rhythm of the sounds suggested something repeatedly flexing under load rather than a single isolated movement. Looking back, investigators believe the noises were likely early signs of structural stress developing within the cantilevered deck and its temporary support system as snow and wind loads continued increasing throughout the storm. As conditions worsened along Ridge Road, a snowplow driver clearing the main access route briefly caught sight of Nikhil Lampkin's snowmobile through a short break in the whiteout conditions. The vehicle was parked near the edge of the construction site close to the deck access point, an unusual sight given the severity of the storm and the near-zero visibility on the ridge. The driver could not clearly see Lampkin himself at first because of the blowing snow, but before visibility closed in again, He recalled noticing a figure moving in the direction of the exposed deck area. Even in a whiteout, that's the one thing you notice. The observation stayed with him because almost nobody else was out on the mountain that day unless absolutely necessary. He continued along his route, focused on keeping the road passable, but the sighting would later become one of the final confirmed indications that Lampkin had returned to the structure shortly before the collapse. Not long afterward, the same neighboring property owner, who had earlier noticed the groaning sounds coming from the direction of the construction site, suddenly heard a sharp, violent crack cut through the storm. Even over the constant howl of the wind, the sound stood out immediately. He later described it as a mix of tearing metal and splintering timber, loud enough to echo across the ridge, despite the blizzard conditions. Almost immediately after the crack came a deep, muffled rumble that continued for several seconds beneath the storm noise. The vibration carried faintly through the ground and nearby structures, suggesting that something large had shifted or collapsed somewhere beyond the whiteout conditions. The sound was heavy and uneven, not like a single impact, but more like a chain reaction, moving downhill through snow and debris. Alarmed, he just stopped what he was doing and went over to the window, trying to peer out through the blowing snow. The visibility was so bad at that point that the whole mountainside was basically gone. Just a white wall out there. He could barely see anything past his own property line, only snow whipping sideways in the wind, almost like the whole world had been wiped out. For several moments, he stood there listening. The storm quickly swallowed whatever sounds followed, returning the area to the same dull roar of the wind that had filled the ridge for hours. He considered contacting emergency services, especially given the unusual noises he had already heard earlier in the day, but the intensity of the blizzard and the isolation of the properties along Ridge Road made it difficult to determine whether what he heard was a structural failure, a shifting snowpack, or part of the storm itself. When later interviewed, he described the noise as unlike anything he had previously heard in the mountains. He compared the initial crack to the sound of a massive tree snapping under extreme pressure, followed by what resembled a compact avalanche or snowslide moving through timber and debris below the ridge. That comparison alone paints a pretty clear picture. Post-incident analysis, based on debris patterns and forensic structural engineering, reconstructed the sequence of events. Nikhil Lampkin had been on the outermost section of the cantilevered deck, likely conducting a final personal inspection. The snow load on the deck had reached an estimated 3 feet of dense, compacted snow, translating to several tons of weight, potentially exceeding 15 tons across the entire deck surface. The wind shear, acting on the broad surface of the deck, added significant torsional and lateral forces, creating a dynamic load that further stressed the compromised structure. The critical failure point was identified as the connection between a primary cantilevered beam and its anchor point within the main structure. The minimalist design, coupled with the inadequate temporary supports and the extreme environmental conditions, led to a sudden and catastrophic structural collapse. The deck, along with Lampkin, detached from the main building. It plummeted approximately 200 feet down the steep, snow-covered cliff face, impacting the terrain below with immense force. The impact, combined with the unstable snowpack on the cliff, triggered a localized avalanche of fresh powder and debris, burying the entire structure and Lampkin under several feet of snow and splintered timber. The precise moment of collapse was likely instantaneous, offering no chance for Lampkin to react or escape. The force of the impact was such that the steel beams were twisted and bent, and the concrete anchors were ripped from their moorings. Local search and rescue authorities were eventually notified after the snowplow operator completed his route and reported the abandoned snowmobile near the construction access point, along with concerns that the property owner may still have been on site. Around the same time, the earlier report from the neighboring property owner describing loud, unusual structural sounds was also relayed to responders, adding urgency to the situation. However, the initial response was significantly constrained by the ongoing blizzard conditions. Even help had to wait, which makes the situation feel even heavier. Visibility remained near zero across the ridge, and sustained high avalanche risk made any ground-based access to the steep terrain below the construction site extremely dangerous. Even trained rescue personnel equipped with avalanche transceivers and probing equipment were unable to safely approach the area. As a result, search operations were delayed and limited to remote assessment and coordination until conditions improved enough to allow safe entry into the debris zone. The decision was made to suspend active search operations until daylight and a slight improvement in weather conditions. A difficult but necessary call given the risks to rescue personnel. The overnight hours were characterized by continued snowfall and freezing temperatures, further complicating any potential survival scenario. The area was cordoned off and a perimeter was established, but no immediate search could be conducted. The local sheriff's department issued a public statement advising against any unauthorized access to the area due to extreme hazards. By the next morning, the storm had started to calm down a bit. Still, there was over 3 feet of fresh snow sitting on the ridge above the town, and things were only just clear enough for search and rescue teams to get back out toward the collapsed site. Avalanche dogs and ground-penetrating radar were deployed as crews carefully worked through the debris field at the base of the cliff, where splintered timber, twisted steel, and compacted snow formed a dense and unstable mass across the slope. Later that morning, nearly a day after the collapse, one of the search dogs alerted to a buried section of debris. Rescuers began probing the area and eventually located Nishil Lambkin beneath several feet of snow alongside fragments of the collapsed structure. Recovery efforts took several hours due to the unstable snowpack and the continued risk of shifting debris on the slope. A subsequent medical examination determined that Lampkin died from severe blunt force trauma consistent with a fall of roughly 200 feet, combined with impact from structural debris. Investigators found no evidence that prolonged exposure or hypothermia was a primary factor, indicating that the injuries were likely fatal almost immediately after the collapse. In the weeks that followed, forensic structural experts and local authorities conducted a detailed investigation into the failure of the cantilevered deck. Their findings concluded that the structure had been overwhelmed by a combination of extreme snow accumulation, sustained high winds, and critical weaknesses in the support system. Snow loads on portions of the deck were later estimated to have exceeded more than 3 times the values accounted for in sections of the temporary design. The report further noted that several safety margins had been reduced during construction after modifications were made to achieve a more dramatic, unsupported appearance. Temporary supports lacked adequate reinforcement for severe winter conditions, and investigators identified signs of prolonged stress and fatigue cracking near key connection points. Wind exposure along the ridge further increased the load on an already compromised structure. Records and interviews indicated that both the site foreman and a junior engineer had raised concerns about the temporary support system prior to the storm, and that additional bracing had been recommended. Investigators ultimately concluded that the collapse would likely have been preventable had standard engineering guidance and safety protocols been followed. The incident led to increased scrutiny within the local building community. In the months that followed, regional authorities revised construction requirements for exposed alpine structures, including stricter snow load calculations, mandatory independent structural reviews for cantilevered designs, and stronger temporary support requirements during winter construction. Among contractors, the updated standards were informally referred to as Lampkin's Law, a quiet reminder of how one of the region's most ambitious builders was ultimately undone by the same environment he believed he could outmatch.